Okay, hi back everyone. We hope you had a nice coffee break, making some new connections, chatting a little bit. I think it was also a little bit longer than we told you, so hopefully that was nice. Now onto the thematic part of the meeting. So we're going to be exploring feminist foreign and development policy, navigating challenges and embracing opportunities. And as Sophie said earlier, we're joined by three amazing speakers who you can see online right now. If you want to all wave, Sheena, Anna, and Professor Tony, we can see you here. I'll introduce them properly in a bit as well. And they'll all have a slot for a presentation, and then after that we'll have time for a Q&A, and then we'll be moving into breakout groups where you can discuss what you've heard a little bit more and reflect further. But first of all, I'll now hand over to Jessica, who's going to give us a little bit of an introduction about feminist foreign policy and feminist development policy. So over to you. Yeah, you can.
Hi, everyone. So lots of you know more about feminist foreign policy than I do, probably, but we just thought we'd do a kind of leveler to start off. I'm just going to do a really brief introduction. Sophie, can I do just do a brief introduction of what feminist foreign policy is and isn't. So as you all know, the concept is increasingly popular, and there are 16 governments who now either have some form of feminist foreign policy or in the process. I'm not going to read them out, but they're up there on the slide. And the source actually that's been put up there is quite a good source in terms of factual information about which governments are doing what. So what is feminist foreign policy? So if you can have the next one. What is feminist foreign policy? The first thing I think that's really important is that there isn't a single definition. There isn't even an agreed scope of what it is essentially whatever a government wants to make of it. And although an increasing number of civil society organisations are suggesting definitions and even starting to grade different feminist foreign policies, I think it's really important that we have to remember that there isn't actually a single definition, and that is in some ways problematic. And the nature of existing feminist foreign policies really differs. So some are explicitly referring to transforming power structures. Some have a clear recognition of colonial legacies. Some are focusing more on peace. Some include economic relations. There's a whole range of things. Some countries like Canada also have adopted a feminist development policy, but not a feminist foreign policy. But that said, there probably are some broad commonalities. Basically, feminist foreign policy tends to be seen as a policy which covers the state's interaction, both with other states and with other non-state actors. So it covers a country's foreign policy, diplomacy, trade and economic relations, security, global governance, development assistance, and some are also arguing that it should include domestic policy. It's usually defined by its goals, often around prioritising the achievement of a more just, equitable, sustainable world promoting human rights for all. It's also sometimes defined by its analysis of how to achieve this, so recognising power structures and the need to dismantle them, including colonial and racist and patriarchal structures. And then others argue that it should also be defined by how it's developed and its accountability. So has it been developed working with civil society, with trade union movements, with feminist organisations and so on? So we get the next, and finally around whether it provides resources. We get the next one. So what's happening in the UK? Well, it's probably not going to surprise very many of you that the current UK government won't use the word feminist. It is interesting how many civil servants have said to me, well, we do really have a feminist foreign policy, we just don't call it that. And it's like, no, you don't. But the Scottish government apparently is in the development phase of its feminist approach to foreign policy. Then finally, as we talked about earlier, the Labour Party has discussed the development of a feminist development policy, and a number of organisations in the room I know are involved in that work. We do the next slide. So then the question for us is it useful? Should we engage? I think certainly for Gender and Development Network, the first point that we kind of had to acknowledge is that it's here. It is a language that's being used. It is being defined. If we don't define it ourselves, other people are going to define it. I think also what we're seeing on an international stage is that it's potentially creating quite healthy competition. So the UK used to consider itself to be one of the like-minded governments, the more progressive governments on gender equality. It's very difficult for them to do that now without talking about a feminist, at least development policy. And I think that's quite interesting for us as organisations based in the UK. And it has, to a certain extent, provided an opening for civil society to engage, although I think we have to be careful about the terms on which that engagement takes place. And I do think we need to be wary, because as we all know, the hardest part of advocacy is when your target starts using and defining your language. And that's exactly what's happening now. And it's very difficult then, because if a government says, but we have a feminist foreign policy, it's much harder to say, oh no, you don't really, because you haven't done this or you haven't done that. And that's where, certainly in the UK, I think it's so important that we come in at the start and say, here's what a feminist foreign policy would actually look like. There's a real danger, I think, that it becomes the latest veneer for governments to say we're doing the right things because we've adopted a feminist foreign policy, and actually carrying on doing what they were doing in the first place. Or they could actually have a fairly good policy and just not provide the resources. They could talk the talk without walking the walk on the resources front. So what's GADN's approach? The first one is, and I think it's really important in terms of the Labour Party looking at a feminist development policy, that we really need to say this has to be a feminist foreign policy, not just a development policy. And I think particularly in terms of decolonising the aid relationship, that's really important, because to say that your development policy is going to be feminist, i.e. what you persuade other governments to do is going to be feminist, but what you do yourself when it comes to your hard economic issues around trade and finance is not going to be feminist, I think is really problematic. The other thing that we think is really important to say from the start is that this is a holistic approach. This is an analysis. It isn't just about a set of deliverables. And it isn't just about getting more women into senior posts. And it also isn't just about gender equality. And I think this is that we all know that feminism is about more than just gender equality, and that needs to be reflected in feminist foreign policy. It's got to be rooted in calls from Southern feminists. And I think this is what's going to be hard for us, is that on the one hand, we need to act quickly to define what a UK feminist foreign policy might look like. On the other hand, we have to work with Southern feminists about how to define that. So some of the things that, just to round up, some of the things that we've been looking for is to say it needs to be based on some core principles. The goal should be around justice, equity, decolonisation, peace and sustainability. That principles, the core principles, should recognise intersecting discriminations. It should challenge prevailing power structures, so recognising the structural barriers that create inequality and discrimination and commit to dismantling them. And it's got to acknowledge the ongoing legacies of British colonialism. It's got to take a decolonial approach to its international work and partnerships, redistributing power to those who are currently excluded. And it's got to be strategic and accountable. It's got to be evidence-based, it's got to be well-resourced, it's got to be coherent with other areas of policy, from foreign to domestic, and it's got to be developed collaboratively with CSO and trade unions, as well as feminist movements in the global south, as well as the global north. Now, as I say, we kind of in a difficult position because we don't feel that as UK NGOs, we should simply say, these are the core principles, you have to do them. This should be done in consultation with feminists from the global south. At the same time, we do need to say to the Labour Party, or if it was to do this to the Conservative government, this is what a feminist foreign policy has to look like if it's worthy of the name, rather than saying afterwards, actually, you got it wrong. So that was just a kind of brief intro before our much more knowledgeable speakers will give you some more depth.
Thanks, Jessica, for that. I hope you can hear me with this one as well. Please tell me if you don't, and I'll use the other one. So moving on swiftly to our speakers online. First up, we have Sheena Anderson, who is a Black feminist intersectional environmentalist, and she works as program manager at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, CFFP, which probably you all know about. And she's leading their work on climate justice and anti-racism, in addition to also being a climate activist. She graduated in international political management and holds a master's degree in peace research and international politics. Sheena's also an experienced anti-bias trainer and freelancer in political education, facilitating seminars on anti-racism and the prevention of right-wing extremism. And as I said, she's currently working for CFFP, where she's working on their new program on a decolonial and anti-racist approach to FFP, which she will also tell us more about today. So thank you so much, Tina, for being here with us, and over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? I think
Yes.
the sound didn't work earlier. Okay. Thank you so much. Perfect. Thanks. Before I start, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to also share the panel with Anna and Tony. I just want to say I'm not feeling very well, so forgive me if I'm a bit slow at some points. So I was asked to give an introduction about our work at CFFP, but specifically focus on the project I'm currently leading, and then on Germany recently, pretty recently, adopting feminist foreign and feminist development policy. So I'll very quickly run through the introduction, but mostly we'll focus on the latter parts. Next slide, please. Or can I can't do that myself, right? Okay, next slide, please. So just very short, we're established in 2018. We mainly focus on research, very small part on consulting, but mainly advocacy work, are dedicated to an intersectional feminist and people-centered approach to foreign policy. And that's been mentioned already, but trying to aim or use feminist foreign policy as a mechanism for equity, justice, solidarity, and peace. Next slide, please. Our mission to smash injustice and oppression in foreign policy as an inherently unjust area and field of work, and to see an intersectional approach to foreign policy adopted globally. Next slide, please. And next one. Thanks. We have 6 key program areas. I'll just mention them real quick, but the first one being feminist foreign policy in general. So staying updated on the development of the concept, doing our own knowledge production when it comes to that, staying in contact with other feminist organizations in Germany, but also abroad, about the concept. Peace and security, where we mainly focus on demilitarization and disarmament, mainly nuclear disarmament, and specifically in the German context, focusing on getting rid of nuclear weapons who are currently stationed in southern Germany. Like, they're not German nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons being stationed in Germany. Anti-racism, I'll go into that when I'll talk about the project. Next slide, please. There we go. Climate justice, which is also a program I lead, where we mainly focus on what a feminist climate foreign policy would look like. Germany, for example, currently develops another strategy on climate foreign policy. And another aspect is focusing on climate and militarization. So we currently see a heavy militarization of the climate crisis, where climate and environmental defenders are heavily targeted, but we also see an immense militarization of EU borders, for example. So we know that climate migration, or people being forced to leave their home due to climatic reasons, increases, but then are met with a quite brutal and militarized border regime kind of the EU. And the last one is intersectional climate justice, and what that can look like specifically in an international aspect. Human rights, where we mainly focus on sexual and reproductive rights, as well as LGBTI plus rights. And then the last one, international cooperation, or what many know as so-called development policy, which Germany also adopted or tries to adopt a feminist one. Next slide, please. And next one. I already said that, so next one. Thank you. Before I go into the actual project that I'm currently working on, just quickly wanted to introduce this. So on a kind of German level, we established a network for young women and non-binary people interested in foreign and security policy, but who are kind of usually cut out or marginalized by broader German society. So a lot of racialized young people, people who identify as Muslim, people with disabilities, people without a German passport, and a refugee background or a migrant background, so-called migrant background. That's the direct translation from German language. Yeah, where we try to offer a network that supports each other and provide connections to policymakers, but also provide workshops for the mentees, what we call the young people engaged in the network, come together and learn with and from each other, but also experienced experts on various topics, and really have a kind of a hub and a community to be there for each other in a field that is yeah, still very, very exclusive. Yeah, and next one, we can skip that one. I'll go further into the project with the next slide. Yeah, so since the beginning of this year, we have a project funded by Open Society Foundation focusing on what a decolonial feminist foreign policy would look like. That is based mainly on the fact that Germany is the first country to publish a strategy on feminist foreign policy and actually at least mention something about colonial past, although I think it only comes up in one sentence actually, so it's very limited. But we wanted to do something to specifically hold the German government accountable of what that would actually mean. And getting or establishing a working group, I'll get to that in a second as well, but establishing a working group of experts who do decolonial work in different fields, and coming together and elaborating what that would actually look like specifically for countries who are now adopting and implementing a feminist foreign policy, but are actually or have been colonizers, but barely dealt with their colonial past. That's specifically the context for Germany. So we really wanted to do something to make clear that a feminist foreign policy always also has to focus on these topics, and to also provide a space in the German but also international context where experts working on these topics yeah, have a chance to come together and exchange. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, some of the overall goals. The first one I kind of already mentioned. So yeah, highlighting colonial legacies and whiteness in feminist foreign policy, specifically, as I said, with regards to the German context. Maybe just adding here, so Germany reached an agreement with Namibia about 2 years ago, a so-called reconciliation agreement on Germany colonizing Namibia or big parts of Namibia, but the controversy around that is that a big parts of Oberherero Nama, who have been victims of German genocide there, against them, haven't been part of this consultation process. So that's something where we are working with diaspora organizations to make it clear that that would have to be a part of a committed German feminist foreign policy to actually include diaspora organizations and direct descendants of Oberherero Nama, and renegotiate the agreement actually. Foster debates with policymakers, civil society, and academia. Yeah, next point I've kind of already mentioned, develop strategies and resources to decolonize foreign and security policy, specifically with this this view on what would that mean from a European and in this case also a German context, and using and advocating for feminist foreign policy as a tool here, so that it's not argued in a way that it's only about putting women into positions of power or gender equality. Next slide, please. So this first year of the project, we established a working group consisting of 12 experts, decolonial activists, economists, but also academics, people with their own organizations or individual activists. And none of them, I think, knew each other before. So we really also tried to bring people together who we haven't worked with and who also haven't worked with each other so far. Having an in-person convening with the working group, informal exchanges, then an event specifically on Germany's colonial past and the reconciliation agreement that I've just mentioned, and also doing a survey on the understanding of feminist foreign policy in formerly colonized countries, with the background that a lot of times people in Germany approach this topic as in a way like bringing feminist foreign policy and development policy to other places, but actually there is very extensive and very dedicated feminist work going on the ground, and not necessarily everyone uses maybe the term feminist foreign policy, but still does incredible feminist work. So what does it actually mean, and what kind of reflection work do organizations in the so-called global north, us included, have to do when working on this topic, and a social media campaign. And next slide. Can I ask how much time do I still have left, so I don't take too much time?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Now?
Yes. Okay, I'll just speak on both. So time is actually up, but
oh no. Okay.
Thank you.
I'll stop here then.
So maybe if you could on there we go. 2 to 3 minutes would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll wrap it up very quickly. Sorry. So I mean, first one is, I think, known. Germany released both strategies actually on the same day, 1st of March, which was surprising because the ministries actually didn't work with each other on the strategies. And from a civil society perspective, we've kind of actually had the feeling they were sometimes working against each other, and it was kind of a race who would publish first, and then in the end they published on the first day. But so now we have 2 very extensive documents, and both of them, for the first time, as I already said, mention a colonial past. The one from the Foreign Office, so on FFP, only once, and not so detailed. I would say in general, the document on Feminist Development Policy is way more progressive. It deals with terms as race, racism, whiteness, etc. So that one definitely is more progressive, although it uses the term post-colonial and not decolonial, but maybe we can talk about it later. And just here mentioning again that I think there's just been a lot of work done by civil society in Germany, but obviously also internationally way before that. So it's not like an idea that comes from the ministries, but that people actually fought for a very long time. Next slide. Okay, maybe the lessons learned, and then I'll stop there. So in general, there's very different understandings of various concepts, including the big concepts of feminist development and foreign policy. I think so. There's just a big difference between the civil society understanding and the ministry understanding. In both cases, there were big consultation processes with groups in Germany and abroad, but I would say they weren't very inclusive. They were also not paid. So a lot of time of civil society dedicated on top of their usual work. And specifically when looking at this from, looking at this aspect of decoloniality and anti-racism in the consultation process, there were no descendants of survivors of German colonial violence or diaspora organizations involved, Black Germans or migrants. Sorry, there's a typo there. Were not involved. So yeah, it's very questionable. And there's a very different storytelling also, yeah, about the process in general between civil society and the respective ministries. And there's been a very long and intensive fight around single words also, for example. So is it okay to have the word intersectionality or not? Is that too radical for the ministry? So we really, it was kind of, yeah, it was very exhausting sometimes, fighting for single sentences and words. But now we have both strategies. We'll have to see how and in what way they are implemented. Right now, I wouldn't say it's in a very feminist way, but maybe that's also something we can discuss later. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sheena. I know 10 minutes is not a lot of time.
It's weird because we can't say people, or I don't know, yeah, but I can see people, but thanks for the clapping. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Everybody in the room and people who are joining us online, please note your questions down if you have any to Sheena, and we can get back to them during the Q&A. But moving on to Ana Velasco, who is a Mexican feminist and co-founder of Internacional Feminista, a collective working to promote dialogues on gender, international relations, and security in Latin America. Sorry, I'm like doing this because I'm not sure if you can hear me, so I'm just using both. Thanks. And Internacional Feminista's mission is to promote critical dialogues about feminism, foreign policy, international security, and diplomacy in Mexico and the rest of the world. Their work centers around analyzing global power dynamics and the roles various stakeholders play in them to inform feminist policies that interweave the local and the global. Anna is also currently a research associate at the Institute for Intercultural and International Studies at the University of Bremen, and her doctoral research project examines state formation of former colonies through the exercise of political violence towards indigenous populations. The site of focus is northwestern Mexico, and it centers the struggle of the Yaqui tribe. And Anna's here today to tell us more about Mexico's feminist foreign policy and some reflections from there. Over to you. Thank you for being here with us.
Hello, thank you very much. And thank you everyone thanks for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here and to share the panel with fantastic colleagues. I think it's the world of feminist foreign policy is not that big, so we end up I think speaking quite often, and it's really cool because it allows to develop networks and I think to carry on this conversation that I was, as was mentioned during the introduction, it's still in an early stage, and I think we're still trying to understand what is this feminist foreign policy really about. And so just to confirm, I have 10 minutes, right? Just to...
That would be great.
Okay, I'll do my best. So first of all, I'd like to say that I'm not here only as me, Anna, and the researcher. I'm also here representing Internacional Feminista. My colleague, Danny Philipson, we always try to present together. But this time, since she's in Australia, it's a little bit complicated sometimes working with time differences. So you have me today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the report we did on feminist foreign policy in Mexico, what has happened since then, and just a bit of an update, hopefully to leave some questions and for the discussion, which I think would be the most interesting part. Okay, so I have my presentation over here because I cannot control that one, right? Okay, so can we move? Yeah. Okay, so I already talked a little bit about it. We are feminist students, academics, and activists. We're very passionate about international relations and diplomacy. We analyze and study foreign policy. It's a little bit of what was already said. So we are trying to build a bridge, in short, between the very, I would say, very healthy, strong feminist movement in Mexico and the debates that are happening in the international community. Sometimes there might be some disconnections, and what we're trying to do is make them work together and to see how and who's really participating in these debates. So the next one, just to give you a bit of the context, in the map that was showed, well, there was this graphic in the beginning. We saw Mexico was presented its feminist foreign policy in 2020. It was first during the speech in 2019 in UNGA, and then in January it was confirmed that, okay, Mexico has a feminist foreign policy. We can see on the pictures the ambassador to the UN. It also coincided with a year that Mexico was a non-permanent member in the Security Council. So there was also presentation of a National Action Plan, or WPS. And Mexico was also a host of the Generation Equality Forum with France. It was a co-chair. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so, but what was happening abroad when this feminist foreign policy, Mexican feminist foreign policy, was presented? It is important to say also that it was framed as the first feminist foreign policy from the global south. And I think this sort of also became a sort of a term that was deployed both by the Mexican government, but also by feminist activists abroad and other people in this feminist foreign policy community that I've mentioned. But there were some dissonances in this praising, because it was really received with a lot of enthusiasm. For instance, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are, but when I speak of a healthy, strong feminist movement in Mexico, I say it with pride, but also I say it because there isn't really a lot of choice not to be a feminist in Mexico. 11 women are murdered violently every day in Mexico, femicides. And so there is a reason why the movement is so strong, because there are protests and there's lots of debate around it, right? Like, why is it happening? Why is it still happening? Why the numbers are not decreasing every year? But along with femicides, for disappearances, etc., there's also a debate around the green wave, which maybe some of you are familiar with in Latin America, and abortion rights. That is moving forward, but the issues of violence are still there. And then the international world, there's been a lot of discussion around activism and academia around the backlash, right, from right-wing movements or right-wing politicians, but some of them with close links to the far right. What does this mean for the struggle that is taking place in many parts of the world? So we had across the border, we had still the influence of Trumpism, and then in Latin America, specifically in the figure of Bolsonaro, who is not in power anymore, there was, we thought, a significance in Mexico positioning itself as feminist in a context where the word is not even, we don't want to use it because we're a little bit shy about it, but it's actually, you know, there's an effort to push back everything that has been gained, and all of the things we haven't achieved yet, right? So we saw and we acknowledged that Mexico made a brave stance considering this context in the region. Okay, I think I'm going to be more than 10 minutes. Okay, I'm going to try to hurry. Okay, the next one about the report. Okay, so Mexico publishes what they say is a feminist foreign policy. And Dan and I and our colleague Dinora also, because it's 3 authors for this report, we said, okay, we need to do something about it, because it was a bit upsetting, honestly, as a feminist, to see the Mexican government being praised as feminists outside, and just knowing that in the protests they use tear gas, for instance, just to put a small example. And so, and the conversation is not really flowing, that we actually learned last year through this huge information leak from the military, that they are actually spying on feminists. So the level of dissonance is huge here. So we said, okay, we need some transparency here. Feminist accountability, you don't just get to publish something that's called feminist and then just nothing happens, right? No one is going to ask any questions. So we started there. And we carried out this independent evaluation. And our idea was to say, well, no feminism without feminists, right? It doesn't have to be our view of feminism, but there has to be something. There has to be some contestation here. So how was it? Just a bit of the methodology. We did information requests through these transparency mechanisms. And we decided, since there is not really a definition of feminist foreign policy, to sort of evaluate what they presented with their own framework. So we are not really making a contrast or comparing with other countries, because that would be unfair. So we say, okay, what you presented, let's see from there what actually happened. So I'm not really going to go into a lot of my idea was to read the main findings and the recommendations, but maybe that's going to take me a lot of time. So I'm going to just go very quickly with the main findings, and maybe the recommendations, I will leave them, and I will invite you to check the report. It's available both in Spanish and English. So just because it's important for the last slide that I really want to spend a couple of minutes there. So our main findings. Well, the feminist foreign policy in Mexico is a broad, very ambitious approach, which kind of implied that feminist foreign policy meant all foreign policy. And of course, that wasn't really happening, because we could see trade and economic policies that are not part of it, migration, security, in particular, the bilateral relation with the US, which is the most important one for Mexico. There was absolutely no hint of feminism there. And we still don't know how to do that, how to go about that, right? So it's actually only present in multilateral fora. And that was very, that was confusing, because Mexico already did that. So Mexico actually has a trajectory of being very forward and very pushing on women's issues since the 70s. So it was a little bit of repacking what they already did into, okay, now it's called feminist foreign policy. That's not bad, but it's not really innovative. And so there were also some more complicated issues, because Mexico actually tried to say, let's first fix the house, and then we talk about what's happening abroad. And even those measures, we couldn't really have enough information to say they were successful or not, because something as basic as recopilating disaggregated data was not happening. So we couldn't actually say if there was an improvement. Do we have more women on the table or not? We don't know, because we're not counting. So some specific things like that. I'm not getting into details, but in case you're curious about it, then I can do it later on. We also figured that there were no, they also spoke of violence against women, protocols inside the secretary, but also with the service they provide to the consulates and the embassies. There were also lots of questions there that were left unanswered. And there was actually no coordination among all of the actors involved in foreign policy in Mexico. There was really, everything relied only in a subsecretary of the ministry. So, I mean, that's clearly insufficient. That's absolutely not mainstreaming. And then when they spoke of intersectionality, it was really done, I don't think they really understood what intersectionality meant, because it was just really still a very binary view of it, and not considering everything else that intersectionality is trying to address. So this is just to give you a very, very quick summary of what we found, but it was, I don't think I'm being fair to our findings. The recommendations, I won't mention them, but we did them. But what happens? So when a small organization decides to do a report like this without funding, well, we don't only want to write something that is read, hopefully, by fellow feminists in Mexico and in other parts of the world, but we actually want to sit with the authorities and tell them, this is what we did, can we work together? And that was very difficult to achieve. The report was published a year ago, and it was not until a month ago that Danny and I were in Mexico that we were finally able to sit, to have a meeting and to talk directly to the ministry. So this is important, because in the introduction it was mentioned that feminist foreign policy is opening a way for civil society to talk to these actors. And I think in our case in Mexico, it's starting to happen. So they finally acknowledged that they had to work with us, and we started to have conversations of what can we do. And also this is relevant because the context changed, right? Feminist foreign policy has been around for long enough to say there might be change of government. So as it happened in Sweden, that might mean it won't continue, right? And so the work with what happens with the work that was done. Mexico has elections next year, and we're actually nervous. We don't know if it's going to stay, but we have what we call some cautious optimism, because there was a change of personnel in the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and we have a new foreign secretary, and she's a feminist. She's been in diplomacy for a long time, and we are really hoping to see, because we know she wants to give priority to feminist foreign policy, and we're really hoping that what she does helps the FFP gain institutional track, so it manages to stay regardless of who wins next year. And I think this is also another question that we need to start discussing among the people in this community. I'm going to stop there because I know I'm above. Sorry about that. I'm hoping to have a conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was really, really valuable. And I'm sure lots of potential to go into further discussion in the Q&A as well. So please do note down your questions. And now, last but certainly not least, we're going to turn to Dr. Tony Hastrup, who is a professor and chair in global politics at the University of Manchester. Her research interrogates the manifestation of power hierarchies in global politics, with research interests encompassing a wide range of topics within international studies, including peace and security in Africa, feminist, post-colonial and decolonial approaches to international relations, and regional and global governance. And she has also published extensively in these areas. In addition to her academic work, Tony frequently works with government institutions and international organizations, offering expertise on themes linked to the women, peace and security agenda, and also feminist foreign policy. She's also a founding member of the African Feminist Collective on Feminist Informed Policies, working to articulate African feminist perspectives in the wake of the multiple adoptions of FFPs. The collective seeks to nurture a space for African feminists to collaborate and harness African feminist knowledge to respond to historic and contemporary injustices and challenges that stem from within and without, so that Africans can thrive. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Tony, for being here with us today, and over to you.
Thank you for having me. And I feel like I should apologize for the overly bright PowerPoint template, but it's been a very difficult week, as I'm sure we all know, so I needed something to cheer me up. So I think it's important to say that I'm not an advocate or an activist in feminist foreign policy, not like the previous two speakers who I feel very privileged to share the panel with today. But I imagine, I guess, when you're a feminist, you're always some sort of advocate or activist. So all that to say that I'm speaking from a very particular point of view, which is one that is academic, which means I think a lot about not necessarily things that can be done in the immediacy, but more long term and in historical context. I was asked to speak to opportunities, challenges, and dangers for feminist foreign policy and feminist development policy. And I think we've had a really good sort of background into sort of what the discourse is around FFP and FDP. So I'm not going to go into that as much, but I'll reflect a bit on basically how, in the context of this work that I've been doing as someone who's weirdly placed in between that sort of policy area, but also civil society, and engaging with those different perspectives, how that has informed some of what I find to be contestations or tensions within FFP and FDP. Can you go to the next slide, please? So as we've heard, to an extent, this new feminist engagement, whether they're sort of formalized in feminist foreign policy, feminist development policy, or simply an acknowledgement that we have to take something like gender equality seriously, I think they've been really useful to centering those things that feminist and women's rights organizations have asked us to prioritize, not just for decades, ostensibly for a century or so, right? So I think that, there's an opportunity here to reflect on the fact that we can finally begin to include the priorities of feminist organizations in the work that is being done in the context of foreign policy. Now, here is where I sort of recede to my academic perspective. Instead of traditional foreign policy analysis, the domestic influences the international. So in a sense, FFP, FDP provides an opening for reflection as to what it is that is going on at the domestic level and how that influences the ways in which we think about what a country does externally. I think as Anna mentioned, feminist foreign policies, broadly defined, has opened up the space for engaging new types of actors in international relations. And I sort of put new in sort of scare quotes because civil society have always been part of international relations practice, but often they've worked in parallel to what it is that states are doing. And where we've seen states declare feminist foreign policy, or at least a commitment to some of the feminist principles that are articulated in foreign policy, it has opened up that space for participation. It has emphasized in some cases, but not most, also emphasized budgetary support for areas of gender equality, emphasis on women's participation. You're almost seen as a pariah within the international system if you're like, no, we don't want women to participate. But also the promotion of specific initiatives like sexual reproductive health and rights, but also things like the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And I think we also see now that the different iterations with the development focus is what is common to most of these feminist foreign policies. In some cases, states declare it as a feminist development policy. In other cases, it is wrapped up within the broader feminist foreign policy. Again, what it means is we're thinking about gender equality in the context of this so-called development cooperation, in a way that perhaps we did not previously think about it, either because it wasn't a priority of the government or there were constraints and folks weren't willing to push through those constraints. The next slide, please. At the same time, there are challenges, there are challenges to implementation, some of which I think Anna has captured really well in the work that they've done in the Mexican case. And I think there are a lot of parallels to different extent and manifesting differently in the context of other countries. But I think there's sort of what I would consider to be more analytical challenges, and yet very important ones that I think it might take a while to sort of disaggregate, but certainly I think something that we all here should keep in mind. The first sort of resolves around the question, what distinguishes gender mainstreaming, which has been advocated for a very long time, from new feminist foreign policy, feminist development policy? What I found is that a lot of states that talk about feminist foreign policy are simply doing very good gender mainstreaming. This is not a bad thing, to be clear, because in a sense, the big critique of gender mainstreaming has been that, if it was done properly, it would actually be a useful thing. It just hasn't been done properly. So I think as a starting point, this is not necessarily a bad thing. But if feminism is to mean anything, I think, based on what we know about both the conceptualization of gender mainstream as well as the practice, if it's supposed to suggest a normative shift in how it is that we think about whether it's development policy or foreign policy in other areas, then there's something troubling about the fact that FFP, FDP is simply good gender mainstreaming. And to a certain extent, even those who are supposed to advocate for a fundamental change and a restructuring of what foreign policy is, are content with this and advocate for this. The second issue that I wanted to mention was, going back to gender itself. And I think both Sheena and Anna mentioned this, that, gender is often quite reductive. reinforces binaries. The emphasis is very much on women. We see that right now in a sort of current context discourses. And I think this is quite reductive, again, from an analytical perspective, but it's actually also very dangerous. You know, I was having a conversation earlier today where someone was asking, you know, we talk about women and children, but why aren't we talking about the men? And I mean, there are reasons to maybe not talk about the men, but I think when we're thinking about gender, it's not enough to just talk about the women, but also women and men, again, are really binary categories. And if we accept that, you know, gender can be fluid and on a continuum, then we need to pay attention to this. And third, I think the more obvious thing is that, you know, we cannot underestimate the anti-gender backlash. So with the same, you got governments who say that they're committed to gender equality, but they undermine this narrative by doing other things that are anti-gender, where, you know, gender equality only works when it confirms their very, very specific understanding of gender. So you've got countries who say, we believe in gender equality. And what that means for us is, you know, if only women would stay at home and have more babies, then our country could be better and we wouldn't have a problem with our economy. And in a way, this is the broader challenge is, like, we cannot take our eyes off the ball of the anti-gender backlash. And that, you know, I've used an example which I actually think is you know, it's an example that is dangerous, but actually it's often a lot more insidious than that and not as obvious. And so I think that one of the things that has to be possible is to reflect internally on, amongst those of us who work in this area of feminist foreign policy, feminist development policy. And next slide, please. This kind of leads me to talking about the dangers. Fundamentally, I think there is a danger of betraying the radical potential of sort of feminist informed thinking and approaches to development and cooperation. And this is one of the things that we've tried to think about within the African collective, where we sort of see a lot of enthusiasm for sort of feminist foreign policy and feminist development policy. We see a lot of engagement with intersectionality. We are slightly aghast by the willing adoption of decolonial. So often, despite not having a singular definition of feminist foreign policy, I'm often quite curious as to what people actually mean by decolonial. So I'm, you know, both the academic in me, but also this sort of person, the Global South origin person in me, does wonder about, you know, the ways in which this agenda has allowed for the sort of watering down of the radical potential of feminism, what I see as a sort of reassertion of coloniality under the guise of emancipation, where feminist foreign policy is once again being reasserted as the thing that the global North does well. And this is not dissipated by the inclusion of global South feminists, because often you engage global South feminists that you're comfortable with, that sort of share the same thinking, and we pat ourselves on the back and we think that we're doing well. And I say that as somebody who sits in a very uncomfortable situation of being of the global South and the global North, in the global North, working in the global South. So this is not to suggest that this is sort of, in a way, I'm posing questions to myself, to you, about things to really think about in the ways in which we function, especially if, you know, fundamentally where I come from is, I don't think, and I've said this to a few people, that I don't actually think feminist foreign policy is possible, because if it were, foreign policy wouldn't exist. But there is something that we're doing, right? So there is something that is called feminist foreign policy. There's something that's called foreign policy. There are inclusions of feminist principles there that are good in of themselves and are progressive. So I think that there is something to work with there. But the last point I wanted to make around dangers is around this question: is feminist foreign policy for everyone? And this question comes from the queries that we've had as well, but also work that we're doing around the UK specifically. There's a the sort of optimism and excitedness around feminist foreign policy suggests that we should always advocate for feminist foreign policy. And I would suggest, no, we shouldn't do that, because it leads to some of those two things that I mentioned earlier. In the United Kingdom today, if, again, you take what I said earlier seriously, the connections between the domestic and the international, it is not possible for indeed any of the political parties to be truly feminist. It is possible to have policies around gender equality. And again, that is not a bad thing. But I do want to caution against advocating for this as the marker of a feminist foreign policy. Again, is it just really good gender mainstreaming, or is it feminist? Next slide, please. And sort of just going into my conclusion, I think, it is here to stay, going back to that very first slide we had. But I think it is always important to ask what is possible. It is okay to not make everything feminist foreign policy. It is especially very, very okay to not call everything intersectional or decolonial. And I would actually suggest that we take a pause around that and actually understand those concepts. The ones that tell us that there can be multiple worlds. We cannot decolonize something that is colonial. And we need to ask ourselves those questions if we are truly aligned to the feminist imperative. I think we are in a place where any of us can conduct feminist analysis. But if we choose to do that, we must always want to interrogate hierarchies within international politics. I question the utility of separating development from foreign policy, because I feel that it is a way that governments use to elide their broader responsibilities and accountability, wherein actually this discussion around feminism has allowed us to be able to potentially hold governments to account. And finally, that what it is that we should probably advocate for, much more so than feminist foreign policy for every state, is a liberation mindset, which probably would mean, in 500 years' time, no state system. But for now, we may seek abolition, an ethical retreat wherein we rethink what development actually is, and potentially replace that with thinking around reparations. And I want to say that, in this conversation, it might sort of seem like I've just talked about a lot of unattainable things. And in some ways, that might be true. But I think that, this push, move, state of feminist foreign policy, feminist development policy, does allow us to think of what is, what can be, and what should be. It doesn't mean that it's happening at the same time, but I think that it's important that as feminists, or those sort of allied to feminism, that our actions always push towards what should be. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. Again, I think lots to discuss. We do have a couple minutes now for some questions. If you could keep your questions short, that would be really helpful. But over to you all. And if we have people joining us online as well, please feel free to put your questions in the chat to our three amazing speakers. Thank you again. Yes. Sorry.
Hello. So I wanted to ask why governments are increasingly using this language, because I think from a political perspective, it's still not a very popular language with the groups that kind of swing elections all over the world. And I think to use the opportunity, we have to understand what's driving it. And I suppose I don't understand why governments are choosing to call things feminist. And if we're worried about co-opting the language, again, why are they choosing to use it when there doesn't seem to be a political advantage? So I'd be really interested to hear thoughts on what is actually driving this shift and how we use that.
Thank you. I'll just take two more questions and then we can go to speakers for responses. Any more questions?
The last speaker questioned the wisdom and efficacy of separating out foreign policy from development policy. And I'd like her to expand on that thought, because for me, people working on development have very specific technical skills, and people working on diplomacy have other technical skills. That's one issue, because obviously the skills could be merged and combined in some halcyon future. But the reality is currently that the UK is using the merger of foreign policy and development to siphon money off that should be spent on development, and often money that should be spent on women and girls, and it's being moved into spending to support Ukrainian refugees in the UK. So it's as far from what I consider to be the ethical use of money that's tagged as ODA as you can get. So I'd just like to put that question to her.
Thank you. One last question for this round.
Thank you, and thank you so much to all the speakers. I was particularly interested in hearing more from what Sheena alluded to about how the feminist foreign policy wasn't being implemented in very feminist ways, and curious to hear more from particularly Germany and Mexico, now that there is such a policy. Indeed, how is it being implemented? And coming from a WPS network, how is it implementation also connected to other commitments made to gender equality, women and girls' rights by these states? And is this FFP actually helping those commitments in those states? Or is it distracting from them? Just very curious about those kind of dynamics as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go back to the stage. I'll recap the question, don't worry. So yeah, first question was, why now? What's driving governments to adopt these kind of policies? Maybe Sheena, do you want to come in on that?
I can, yeah. I think, I mean, from a German context, but I think probably that applies to other countries. It's not like German politicians like jump on this and like all of them use the term feminist. So there is a strong hesitation also, and I think Anna also elaborated on this a bit, but yeah, they wouldn't necessarily use the term feminist. And what we often get is like, oh, can't we call it a humanist foreign policy, or can't we just call it yeah, you know, all of these alternative terms. And I think for me, it's like important to stay open to a discussion about the term. Maybe it isn't the best term, but I think it's so important to point out that it is not just, obviously it's not about women and girls. It should always question and tackle the gender binary, and it is rooted in very radical feminist approaches, and the goal to really achieve justice and peace and equity, but for me, at least in a very radical sense also. And I think that's why I, or also we as an organization, want to stick to the term. Why some politicians and policymakers are still eager to use it, I think for most of them it is a publicity stunt also. It seems like something that's speaking to a younger audience, to younger voters also. So always having in mind that maybe people also do this to get more voters, also to open discussions with certain countries who maybe have a very dedicated approach to gender mainstreaming, or already to feminist foreign policy, so I'm not saying there's no politicians who are committed to this. There are, but I would say a lot of people use the term or are so eager to implement it because they feel like it's, you know, ticking a box and like, we have this, okay, our job is done, but not really doing the actual work behind it. At least that's what I would say specifically for the German context, if that somewhat answered the question.
Yeah, great, thank you so much. Sheena, Anna, Tony, Anna, do you want to come in on that question as well before we move to the next one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of what Sheena has already said, but at the same time, I do think that the choice of feminism is not just branding, because again, a lot of countries have prioritized gender equality. I think feminism is suggesting a normative shift And often it's something that, you know, even politicians who are just using it to be fun and cool are signaling to a particular audience that, you know, they have certain understandings of the world and how they should function in the world, how the constituencies that they represent and their government should function in the world. And certainly when you sort of look at the perspective from Scotland, which is quite unique because Scotland does not have the powers to actually implement foreign policy. It's a sub-national government, and foreign policy is reserved. But at the same time, sort of thinking through feminist informed foreign policy for Scotland is a way for SNP to articulate how it sort of sees Scotland in the world and what kind of force for good Scotland can be. Whether it's actually a force for good or not, or can be a force for good, I think that's that's contested. But I do think sort of that adoption is sort of sending a signal, which is why, despite knowing that you might get backlash for it, some countries are still willing to go about it. And I think we can't discount that at all, which is why I think now there's a lot of conversation about, you know, can we just do feminist foreign policy and not call it that? Of course you could, but I think that there is still something in the naming.
Great, thank you so much. Anna, if it's okay, I'll address the third question to you, which was Sheena and also Anna mentioned that the implementation of the feminist foreign policies wasn't particularly feminist. So some further reflections on that, and then also implementation of FFP connected to other commitments that governments have made. Anna, if you want to come in on that.
Right, okay. Yeah, I was actually thinking of the third question, so I'm going to start there. On WPS and the connection with feminist foreign policy. Okay, so again, I'm going to focus again in Mexico, but then I'll talk about Latin America. So in Mexico, actually, the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan is supposed to be part of the feminist foreign policy. It was actually published after. So somehow they decided that it has to be part of the framework. But honestly, what we know about the feminist foreign policy in Mexico is not actually a project. It's not a document that you can really read, and like the German one, I don't know if you guys read it, but you should. It's not like that. It doesn't have clear goals. It doesn't have resources. It's just a PowerPoint. That's basically the guideline. So if you look at the National Action Plan, well, that is a little bit better. And I've written also about it with Daniela. So that's a little bit maybe the most consistent part of the feminist foreign policy in Mexico. Yet they are not really talking to each other. So the implementation of the National Action Plan is one thing, and the feminist foreign policy is running on another line. So it's just, in theory, they are connected, but in practice, not really. And I think that is also, it's also, just wanted to go back to why they do it. In Latin America, we have observed that these type of commitments happen when we have leftist governments. So you can see the similarities with the Mexican case, the Chilean case, Colombia, and now Argentina. So I'm not saying every one of these governments is equally committed to the feminist agenda or what locally is understood as the feminist agenda. Perhaps Gabriel Boric in Chile is way more outspoken than Petro in Colombia. The case of Argentina, yeah, there was some commitment by Fernandez, especially with the Green Wave and the abortion rights, but it's contentious and it's complicated because there are tensions within the government. So in the case of Mexico, we have a president that is super outspoken anti-feminist, yet we have a feminist foreign policy. And that, just going back to the question, and I'm not saying he's just outspoken because he might be a little bit like he doesn't mention it, but he criticizes the movement super openly, and he's very harsh. So there's a huge contradiction there that, that's already not feminist, right? And so I think I would just, the question of why did they decide to do this, to be frank, I hope there's some research that illuminates that, because I would really be curious to understand the process, the bureaucratic process, and who pitched the idea to the foreign ministry, why they decided to take it. My initial thought, the cost was very low. because they just repacked what they already did. There was no accountability mechanisms, so why not? And you're going to look good against Brazil, which is your regional rival. So that's just my ideas. Maybe that's not what happened, but I think maybe that answers a little bit.
Thank you, Anna, for those very honest reflections. The room is laughing if you can't hear. Just handing that question to Sheena briefly as well, so for some short reflections on the implementation not being very feminist in Germany either.
I think, yeah, specifically here, and I think I mentioned this before, so civil society was consulted a lot, but not paid for giving expertise and providing, their knowledge, which I think is just exploitation, but yeah. Another thing is very specific groups were consulted and others not. So I don't know how well people know the German context, but 25% of the German society are what Germans call people with migration background, by which Germans actually mean non-white people. And none of the groups that represent these people or that are minority groups were actively invited or included, which I think is a big mistake. And there is until still now, so it's been 2 years, almost, a bit more than 2 years since the election, so almost 2 years since we had the coalition deal first promising a feminist foreign policy, and there's no separate funding for implementing feminist foreign policy. So we have the strategy and we have people working on it, but no extra positions. So it's just people who already work in the Foreign Office, and it's been put on top on their desk. So there's no specific funding. There are people responsible for it, but they're very hard to reach. They're overworked. So I think that all that is not very feminist. Then the right, as in so many other countries in Europe, is on the rise, also in Germany, which is very bizarre considering our history, but somewhat not surprising. And there's also not a clear dedication to protect feminist foreign policy. So also something happening, as we saw in Sweden, could happen in Germany when there's election in 2 years, but also using very feminist language. There's no mirroring back that to internal politics, which is not feminist at all. And there's also very strong interministerial blocking and lack of exchange. So the Ministry of Development Aid and Affairs is not working very closely with the Foreign Office. So that makes it incredibly hard for civil society to reach necessary people, but to actually move projects forward. And I think that's been mentioned before also, but I would personally say a strong, watering down of very radical feminist concepts, such as intersectionality, but also others, which are either watered down or promised in the first case, and then they're not used at all later on. So these are some of the things that I would say don't necessarily lead to a very feminist implementation of feminist foreign policy.
Thanks so much, Sheena, for those reflections. And the last question from the first round was addressed to Tony. So just to explain a little bit more about the separation of development from the foreign policy.
Right. So I guess this was asked in the specific context of the UK. Yes, there was a merger of DFID with the FCO, and in Germany, you've got 2 separate offices. But a lot of countries don't have separate offices between the foreign policy and development. So this was just in the same way that it was a political decision to separate them, it's a political decision to bring them together in terms of the institution. But also it's a political decision on how to spend the money. I don't think that has anything to do with the fundamentals of what development is or what foreign policy is, because development policy is a foreign policy. It is a way that states articulate what they consider to be, quote unquote, their values, right? In the last few days, we've seen a lot of, again, contention about how aid can't be spent. And I like to think common sense prevailed very quickly. But it's one of the, again, it's the quiet part said out loud. Of course, aid is not an altruistic, it's not altruistic. It is part of foreign policy. Now, why did I say that I don't think it should be separated in the context of FFP? Because when it has been a way for states to say, we do gender equality well in the context of development, maybe even stretching to women, peace, and security agenda. But we will still keep, quote unquote, hard security separate. We will keep our interests separate. Yet it's those very same things that are implemented in the name of interest that undermine development, regardless of whether it's feminist or not, and indeed feminist development policy. I don't necessarily see a change with the adoption of feminist foreign policy. And you see this very much in Canada. One of the reasons Canada's been negotiating or trying to get a feminist foreign policy for 4 years now. You would think it would be the easiest for Canada, which had a feminist international assistance program, which would be really easy to just slip into feminist foreign policy. And when you really start to question the fundamental basis of your foreign policy itself, we see how easy it is to do feminist international assistance and not be very feminist in the ways that both Anna and Sheena have articulated. So I don't, to my mind, it's not very useful to make that distinction if what we want to do is to sort of rethink what a country's external relations are. And in any case, when we're thinking of feminist foreign policy, I think we should think about development. We should think about security. We should think about defense. Most countries that do feminist foreign policy in the global north, they don't want to think about things that might fall under home affairs, for example. And there's a reason for that. So you can talk about feminist foreign policy, do just development, but not want to engage with some of those issues. So in the end, I think that it will boil down to whatever preference existing institutions of whatever state. But I don't think that normatively or analytically, there's something that is particularly very distinct in terms of what it is that states do that should make development policy special from foreign policy.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for sharing those additional reflections. We really don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, but we can take one last question. Okay, a hand just shot up very quickly, so I'll go there.
Hello, thank you so much to all of you. It's been a lot to think about, really. My concern with possibly the UK, whatever stripe of new government we're going to have, adopting a form of feminist foreign policy, is not just the repackaging and what we discussed so far, but I wonder whether that could play into the hands of the anti-gender movement, because if the cognitive dissonance between thinking you're doing feminist foreign policy and actually what you're doing domestically leads to like a race to the bottom at the multilateral level for a country that's so important, like the UK is one of the P5s, is like lowering the bar and actually playing into the hands of the anti-gender movement. I don't know what speakers think about that. Because I feel like if we look at like a refugee and asylum policy here in the UK, it's like renouncing completely your responsibilities, which should be shared internationally. So it's like, what's the incentive for other countries to actually, comply with their responsibilities?
Thank you, Chiara, for that very easy last question. Any reflections on that?
Sorry if I may. I mean, I don't think the anti-gender community sentiment needs any help, regardless of whether you have a feminist foreign policy or not. I mean, I sort of stated my concerns about why I don't think the UK should go with a feminist foreign policy. But I think just as we see now, the UK doesn't necessarily live up to its obligations anyway without having a feminist foreign policy. So if we're going to go for a feminist foreign policy, it has to be introducing some sort of fundamental change. I don't think that simply that if there's that move, that's the thing that is going to get the anti-gender movement riled up, because they already are, and we're living in it right now. And in any case, this is also the shortcoming of feminist foreign policy, is that because it says foreign policy, it's easy to do things externally than internally. So if the fear is around the anti-gender within the UK, then, it's all good. I just don't think we should be going for feminist foreign policy at all, because I actually don't think that we behave in any feminist way. We don't. I mean, we speak about the anti-gender movement as if they're separate from some of those people wanting us to do feminist foreign policy. I don't think there always are in the UK. And that's the scary bit. And I think that, that's where we need a bit of nuance around what it is that we call feminist in the context of foreign policy.
Thank you, Tony. Any further last reflections on that from Sheena and Anna?
I'm not entirely sure if I fully understand your question. I can't see you, but whoever it was. But I would just really strongly advocate for never not doing anything, because we're afraid that the anti-gender movement might be further on the rise. They're on that way currently anyway. And I think the best thing we can do is doing very radical and feminist things in a response to that, or not even in a response, just doing that anyway, because I think probably all of us who are in this field already anyway feel the strength and the power of the so-called anti-gender movement. They're very well funded, very well connected everywhere. So I think the response actually has to be doing more work that kind of, can I say that pisses them off? But yeah, because it's like, I often also respond to people in Germany who say that, like, my whole existence already is something that people apparently feel threatened by. It's the same in other countries and for other people. So for me as a person, like just me as an individual, that's not an option. I hope it's never an option for my organization and other feminist organizations. So yeah, I would never say that we shouldn't do things just so they are not on the rise, because if that would happen, they won anyway, because that's kind of what they want, to threaten and fear people in a way, or make people fear them in a way that we are not even thinking about doing and implementing certain things. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sheena. And Anna, any last reflections from your side?
I think they already responded very well to the question, in my opinion. I would only say perhaps that your question, as I understood it, was focused in the UK, but I would just say in other countries it might take a different shape, because, for instance, in Mexico, and I'm pretty sure this is the case in the rest of Latin America, foreign policy is not necessarily something that voters really care a lot about. It crosses through a class lens. So there is a reason actually why I think the current government also decided to navigate this in a bit more daring standpoint, because people in Mexico are really the time that is dedicated every election to foreign policy is minimal. Maybe like 2 minutes in the debates of the presidential candidates. People are worried about other stuff because we don't have a broad presence abroad. So even if we have a feminist foreign policy, and these people from the far right and the backlash, these people, they want to criticize it or do something. I don't think that means a lot for them. It won't translate into a lot of support. That comes with its complications in itself. But I'm just saying, foreign policy might not be the same in some other countries. It doesn't have the same priority. It doesn't matter, it doesn't affect everyone, but it's not in the public discourse. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you for that. And thank you to Sheena, Anna, and Tony for joining us today and for taking the time to being here with us. I think I speak for everyone when I say that your presentations were really, really insightful, and also just the opportunity to discuss further with you. And I'm sure there are a million more questions, and we would love to have 3 more hours to go into more depth, but time is limited as usual. And thank you so much for being with us. Okay, can we stop the Zoom? And thank you for people that joined.